All right, we last week, or not last week per se, but the last time, we finished up really looking at Genesis chapter 3. Remember chapter 2, 3, and then ultimately Revelation chapter 22. And we noticed, although I erased them, we noticed what four things were found in Genesis chapter 2. Who remembers? Okay, water. Which tree? All right, tree of life. All right, God and man. All of those were there in Genesis chapter 2. What happened in Genesis chapter 3? In one sentence. All right, one word. Okay, there we go. Sin, right? You have sin, but what does that do? What was the end result? All right. Did you have the river, the tree of life, man and God all together any longer? No, man has now been separated. Isaiah chapter 59 and verse 2, your sins have caused a separation between you and your God. Your iniquities have made it to where he turns his face so that he does not hear, right? Isaiah chapter 59 and verse 2, your sins cause a separation between you and God. That's what took place. In a very real sense, they were ejected from the garden, and there was the cherubim that was placed there with the flaming sword to make sure that they did not enter in and have access to the tree of life again. And yet, even so, we get to Revelation chapter 22, and what four things do we find there? All right, water, great river, tree of life, God and man are all there once again. And so we said this is ultimately the story. This isn't a handbook for life, a manual for how to live, the answers to all the questions. Do you find things such as that within here? Yeah, you do, absolutely. But that's not what this is at its heart. What this is the ultimate story of love of a God who did not give up on his creation, but instead has created the means by which his creation is there with him in the end in the same way it was in the beginning. So as we continue through, and of course we're not going to stay on the same level of detail that we were in Genesis chapter 3. Excuse me. What happens in Genesis chapter 4? Okay, the story of Cain and Abel. Are y'all familiar with the story of Cain and Abel? Is there anyone who could give me a decent synopsis of the story of Cain and Abel? Go ahead, Serena.
Well, they were brothers. They both offered a sacrifice. Abel offered his sacrifice of his first fruits. Cain did not. Cain became angry, slew his brother, and was punished by God for that by having to basically wander the rest of his life, and yet did have some protection from God.
Okay. All right, very good. Yeah, they both present an offering. First of all, why do they present an offering? It's a trick question. We have no idea. There's no motivation for this that's given to us. We don't know why. It doesn't even seem as if God has even asked for any kind of an offering. They simply present an offering. There's some kind of official worship that is in place at this point in time. And so they present their offerings. As Serena pointed out, there's a difference between their offerings. What's the difference between them? I'm sorry, say that again.
one was pleasing to God, or God was pleased by it, and the other was not as pleasing to God.
Okay, so one was pleasing, one wasn't, and that's the result of their offerings. Josie, what'd you say again? All right, veggies versus meat. So one of them presents veggies, one of them presents meat. But is that really the ultimate difference between them? All right, Jonathan said Abel offered the best that he had, Cain did not. And you see that as the way that they're described, right? Let's see, verse 3, in the course of time, Cain presented. Well, let's look at Abel's first. Abel presented an offering. What did he present? Some of the firstborn of his flock and their fat portions. Are we going to see this kind of language later? Yeah, we're going to see this as descriptive of really, I think what Jonathan said, the very best that he had to offer. What about Cain? How is his sacrifice described? Joshua, run it by your parents real quick. How was his sacrifice described?
Verse 5 says he had no regard in New Mexico.
Okay. Yeah, there in verse 3, he presented an offering. Right? He took some of his stuff. It's like, well, I need to present an offering. What do I have sitting around here? Let me grab some of it. Is there, though, a sense in which he could have presented his best? I mean, it was not meat. Is there any kind of offering by which it's considered to be the best of a fruit type of offering? Yeah, Ryan?
So without any specific recorded direction from God about the offering, I believe he could have. Mm-hmm. He could have given, the best of whatever he was growing, and in a sacrifice, because that's what the offering is supposed to be, a sacrifice, not a, here's the leftovers.
Yeah, absolutely. And you have sacrifices that are non-animal sacrifices within the law of Moses, right? The first fruits, sacrifices, the very best that there is to offer. He could have done something, but apparently, if all that we're given is just the information that's in the narrative itself, there are extra words that describe Abel's. There are no extra words that describe Cain's. Abel's is pleasing, Cain's is not. And so it seems as if the issue boils down to one of them put some more thought into it, gave the very best that he had to offer, and the other didn't. And then as Serena said, Cain got upset about this. The Lord actually came to him, said, look, just calm down. You can do better in the future. Next time. Get him next time. Things will be all right. But he just couldn't let it go. He takes Abel out to the field, kills him. And what you have now is another Genesis 3 moment. This time outside of the garden. This is our first fall narrative outside of the garden. And it runs kind of parallel from here in the same way that who shows up after the deed is done? All right, the Lord shows up. Does he know what's happened? Yes, but what does he do? All right, he says, he comes up to him, says, hey, Cain, where's your brother? Gives him the opportunity, the same way that he did in Genesis chapter 3. Cain does not own up to what he's done. And then you have a curse that is given onto Cain because of this. So we're seeing a repetition. You're supposed to see Genesis 3 now carry over into Genesis chapter 4. The parallels are supposed to be carried over. And as you follow, starting in verse 17, the genealogy of Cain, it goes down and it ends in verses 23 and 24 with the boasting of this guy named Lamech. Now, what does he have to say? Mike?
And badder.
Yeah. If you thought Cain was a really big bad guy, wait till you get a load of me, right? Yeah, he at least just killed his brother. Here's what's happened to me. Listen to my voice, you wives of Lamech. Pay attention to my words. I killed a man because he wounded me. A young man because he struck me. Just because he hit me, I killed him. He's bragging, it seems, to his wives about his injustice and very willful injustice. By the way, we didn't state it, but with Cain and Abel, what do we have? The very first what that takes place? All right, not only the very first murder, but the very first... Well, it's not the first sin. We saw that in 3. Someone may have said it, but I'm not hearing great.
Murder of a brother.
Okay, not. We already have murder. It's the first death. This is the first time somebody dies. And the first death is not Adam. The first death is not Eve, even though they were the ones who were told, when you eat of this, you will surely die. They're not the first ones to actually suffer that punishment. The very first goes to their son. And remember before, when I mentioned about Eve, that she probably is feeling a much greater sorrow with the death of her son than the pain that physical pain that she would have felt in the childbearing. In fact, at the beginning of chapter 4, she does go through the childbearing experience. Does she talk about how painful it was? No. In fact, she seems to be joyous at this. She conceived and gave birth and said, I have made a male child with the Lord's help, or whatever that's saying. That's an insanely difficult, horrible, I don't want to deal with the Hebrew passage of Scripture right there. But it has this idea, though, I think it is celebratory. And, she is delighting in the fact that she has a child. And again, they gave birth to Abel. No mention at all of physical pain, any kind of increased physical pain. But you get down to the end of this narrative. In verse 25, Adam was intimate with his wife again, and she gave birth to a son and named him Seth. Why? What does she say? God has done what? All right. God has granted to me, given to me, another son to do what? What's the purpose here? Okay, say that again into the mic.
Instead of Abel.
All right, instead of Abel. This is a replacement for what was lost. This is to replace Abel, whom Cain killed. Can you feel the emotion in this naming? That she says, I've lost Abel, and pretty much I've lost Cain, and now this is the son that's been granted to me in order to replace what has been lost. And so that's what you find in chapter 4. We now have the very first death that has occurred. And the very first death is not a natural death. It's a death that is directly the result of sinful behavior, murder between two siblings. And this leads us then into chapter 5. In chapter 5, we have a genealogy. And this genealogy, excuse me, this genealogy is slightly different from just any other genealogy because of a phrase that keeps popping up over and over and over. You see this phrase at the end of verse 5, at the end of verse 8, at the end of verse 11, at the end of verse 14, at the end of verse 17, at the end of verse 18, at the end of verse 27, at the end of verse 31. What is this phrase that keeps getting repeated over and over? And he died. Now, other genealogies don't include this. In fact, when you think about it, do you really need to have this information in a genealogy? It's kind of a given, isn't it? The focus of the genealogy is not about a person's death. The focus of a genealogy is about the continued line. It's about the life in genealogies, isn't it? That you live and you produce this child. And now this new life that you produced is now going to produce this child. That's the way that genealogies run. They focus on life. This one's different because what is the focus here? Not just that new life is produced from generation to generation, but what? But they die. That's why Genesis chapter 5 is often referred to as the genealogy of death, because it is hammering in the point. Death, 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 death. Now that sin has entered into the world, what has come through sin? And death through sin. Therefore, death spread to all men. Why? Because all sin. Now, there is obviously a secondary way to understand death, which is really a separation, right? I mean, that's what death ultimately is, a separation of life from the body. And very much in Genesis chapter 4, Genesis chapter 5, and moving forward, it very much carries a physical concept. You're supposed to see physical death is now a reality because of sin, and it's hammered home over and over and over. But what other reality are we supposed to see from Genesis chapter 3 that is a death that's caused from sin? All right, say it again. A spiritual death, for lack of a better term. It's a separation from God, right? It's not a separation of life from the body. It's a separation of man from God, that all of us, as we sin, our sins separate us from God. And so from a very real sense, as you go through Genesis and really through the rest of the Bible, both of these aspects, I believe, are in play when you talk about death from Genesis 3. It's not only talking about physical death, and it's not only talking about spiritual death, even though both of those are under consideration. You get into Genesis chapter 6, and what does Genesis chapter 6 have to do with death? Okay, Jan just said the whole world. Is that what you said? That's what I heard. Okay, all right, very good. The whole world now. Why? What is the story we're getting into in Genesis 6? All right, the story of Noah. We're getting into the flood narrative. And it really begins, verse 5, the Lord saw the human wickedness was widespread. That is, sin has spread to all the earth, and every inclination of human mind was nothing but evil all the time. The Lord regretted that he had made man on the earth, and he was deeply grieved. By the way, that word grieved right there, that he was deeply grieved, that's the same word that back in Genesis chapter 3 for Eve's sorrow in conception and Adam's sorrow in his labor, in his toil, in his work. And so it's the same word. He says, woman is going to have sorrow in childbearing, child rearing. Man is going to have sorrow now in his work. And this is now even used of God, who because of sin, God looks at his creation and he has the same sorrow as he sees that human wickedness was widespread. Every inclination of the human mind was nothing but evil all the time. So, what does God do about this? What does he say he will do? All right. I'm going to wipe out mankind, whom I created off the face of the earth, with the animals, creatures that crawl, birds of the sky. In other words, what is he saying that he's going to do? Start over. What would that look like? You ever thought about that? What would it look like for God to start over? Any ideas? Any thoughts? Mike, are you itching to say something, or are you just looking?
Oh,
yeah,
both.
Go for it.
I would say if he starts over, completely over, that would be like everything goes away. There is no salvation for any of mankind. It's done. It's gone. And he would start over with a new earth. And new folk.
All right. So there is a sense in which starting over would be kind of like, if you're on the Great Baking Show or whatever it is, and your thing just totally messes up completely, and you dump it in the trash, you bring the ingredients out, and you hope you can get it done in time, right? I mean, you could have that, perhaps, concept here. But let's say that he doesn't. Let's say that he keeps all the pieces that he has. But what did he do in the beginning? In the very beginning, what did God do? Genesis 1. All right, but how? What did he do? In creation, what was there to begin with? Well, there's something there. What was there to begin with? Water, right? Keep in mind, and this is one of the things, by the way, that in a deep study of Genesis 1 through 11, we would have really commented on this. And by the way, Cliff, even in an email conversation that I had, pointed this out, and I was really excited that he saw this, and I had to have somebody point it out to me. Water's there in the beginning. We think of creation ex nihilo, out of nothing, but that's more our conception than the ancient conception of creation. In the ancient conception of creation, it starts with water. And then what did he do? He started dividing the waters, is what he did in creation. He divided the waters from the waters to create the expanse of the heavens. He created the waters from the waters so that the land could come up from it. And then he started filling the land with all of the swarms of the creatures, the critters, the bugs, and all of those things. And then he started to fill the expanse of the heavens, the waters themselves, and the land, and ultimately mankind being the last of it. And so if he's going to decreate, what might that look like? everything's going to go back to water once again. I think it's important that we see this is what God is doing. And, excuse me, notice in chapter 1 and in verse 2, it says, the earth was formless and empty. Darkness covered the surface of the watery depths. And what does it say? The Spirit of God was hovering over what? All right, over the face of the waters. So, in the very beginning, the Spirit of God is hovering over the face of the waters. Now, we know with Noah, he tells Noah to build this big old boat, and he does so. They fill it with the animals that are appropriate, and so they have 2 of each kind, 7, remember, of certain kinds, and they bring it all. His family comes on, they seal the door, and the rains come. And notice in chapter 7 and in verse 18, what does it say now about this boat? Chapter 7 and verse 18. What does it say about this boat? Okay. All right. Now this boat is on. It's not the same word as hover, but this boat is now on, but the rest of it is exactly the same. The boat is on the face of the waters. I think you're supposed to see a direct connection back to chapter 1 and verse 2. Decreation has now been completed. We've gone back to just the waters, and now it's not the Spirit of God, but now it's what? It's the boat. Who's in the boat? Man. What is man? 1:26. The image of God. The icon, the idol of God, right? Now, man, the image of God, hovers over the face of the waters. Before it was the Spirit of God hovering, now it's the image of God. Man, God's representative, who now hovers over the face of the waters. And so now we're finished with the decreation. So what is God going to do? It's time to recreate. And eventually the waters separate from the land again. And then the land starts to become populated again with all of the trees and the shrubberies and everything else that's there. And we know the story with the birds being sent out. And then finally the ark, the boat, comes to rest on the mountain. And we know the rest of this story. When you get to chapter 9, now that we've decreated and we have now recreated, what we have is a brand new Genesis 2 scenario that's taken place. Man is now stepping out, Noah steps out on a place where the sin has been washed away. And this is now a pure place for him. And what does God then do in chapter 9?
Tells them to be fruitful and multiply.
Okay? All right. Hold on to that thought for just 1 second, Mike, because that's really important. What'd you say, Jan? Was that? All right. He provides a new covenant relationship with this new creation. And part of that new covenant relationship, as Mike just pointed out a second ago, as he's introducing a new covenant, he tells them in verse 7, you be fruitful and multiply. Spread out over the earth and multiply upon it. Mike, why is that important to our discussion? Or is it? Mike, yeah, sorry. Mike, I was asking you, why is that, be fruitful and multiply, why is that important?
Well, we're supposed to do the same thing. So, I
Okay,
guess.
but instead of looking forward to us, who was told to do the same thing?
Oh, Adam and Eve.
Yeah, this goes back to it's the exact same thing that God told Adam and Eve upon creation. He said, here's your job as the image of God in the world. Be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, and subdue it, right? And then he does away with creation. He reverses creation until it's just water again and the image of God over the face of the waters. And now we're recreated. The animals are dispersed. Everything's there again. And he comes back and he says, all right, here's your job. Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. Don't miss the fact that this is the exact same language from Genesis chapter 1. And then he establishes this covenant, promises that never again is he going to just simply wipe everything out with the flood waters, which means he's not going to do what again? What? Okay, the idea of starting over, he's done it once, and he's not going to do it again. This doesn't mean, hey, I'm not going to have any more floods. This is very symbolic of him saying, I'm not going to just simply uncreate and then recreate again. I've done it once, I'm not doing that again. And then he gives a sign. What's the sign of this covenant? Go ahead, Logan, what's the sign? All right, good job, very good. A rainbow. He puts this bow in the sky. Now, we think of a rainbow. We understand what a rainbow is, refracted light, all of that fun stuff. But what's the picture of a rainbow? Now, we call it a rainbow, but he calls it a bow, right? What's a bow? All right, very good. Whoever just said that. It is a bow. Yes, right? You know, you've got the world, and then you've got this bow in the sky. When you hear the word bow, what do you think of? Kathy, what do you think of?
I think of archery.
Archery. That's what we're supposed to think of. That's what this is. And there are two ways that I think make a whole lot of sense in explaining the bow in the sky. First of all, does red show up, by the way? No? Yeah, let's do a different color. I wish I had yellow up here as a joke so I could try that one, but I don't. This is the only other one that I have. Does that show up? No, vaguely, maybe. I don't know. Oh, there's the black marker. Let's see if black shows up. How's that? Is that better? Okay, we'll go with black. There are two ways that you can understand the idea of the bow in the sky. Anybody want to venture a guess as to the symbolic nature of this bow? Don't worry, if you're wrong, I will taunt you mercilessly. So just throw it out there, whatever. Yeah, Serena.
Does it have anything to do with the guards at the gate of Eden?
Okay, that's a really good thought. I don't think so. And I'll explain why in just a moment, because it goes along with one of the ideas behind it. But in a way, yes. And so we'll talk about that in just a second. Very good thought, though. Anybody else have an idea? All right, first of all, how many of y'all have a bow? Some of y'all do? Yeah, this may not work because it may not be what you all do with it. But when you get finished hunting, what do you do with your bow? You put it away. You hang it up. You put it on the wall because you're done with it, right? And maybe that's the imagery that the bow is put in the sky as a way of demonstrating that God is finished with the bow, with the destruction. And he hangs it up on the wall, and we always are able to look at it anytime that it rains and it pours, and we say, oh no, is it happening again? We're reminded, no, it's not happening again. There is an ending to it. God has hung up his bow, and he's not going to do this. You're going to have rain. You might have some flooding, but this isn't going to happen. And the rainbow in the sky is a symbolic description that lets us know God's not using that again. He hung it up. He's done with it. Does that make sense? All right. Does anybody have any questions on that idea? All right. Here's the second idea, and I actually lean towards the second one a little bit more. If this is a bow, and this kind of goes along with what Serena was talking about earlier, which way is this bow facing? Up, towards God, right? In other words, God's made a promise. And by the way, he says that he puts this bow in the sky as a reminder to whom? All right, as a reminder to himself. It's not for our benefit. It's beneficial, it's helpful. We look at it and we're like, okay, that helps us. But that's not the wording that he gives. Verse 14, whenever I form clouds over the earth and the bow appears in the clouds, I will remember my covenant between me and you and all the living creatures. Water will never again become a flood to destroy every creature. This, he says, is for me to see, so that when I see it, I won't destroy again. Josie? All right, so Josie's question, and a good observation, when you are handing a dangerous weapon or utensil of some sort, you put the dangerous end toward yourself, not the other individual. Perhaps then is God giving this bow with the dangerous end pointed towards himself instead of us for that reason. There may be something to that, but I think the real thing, though, is this is for God to look at. And if you were to kind of imagine, but take the drawing for what it's worth, whatever. Let's just say there's an arrow that's notched. That arrow is pointing at God, so that if God were tempted to destroy the world again in this way, what does the bow do? It's there to protect us. It's pointing at him as a reminder to him. I mean, that's the way that it's written. When I see it, then. And so this is a reminder. It's very specifically for God, so that God, when he sees it, he goes, oh, that's right. I will not come and do this again. Yeah, Becky. Was Jesus on the cross the releasing of this particular arrow? I'd have to do some thinking along those lines, because this still hasn't gone away. The bow is still there, and the promise of not destroying everything in a flood is still there. So to that end, I would say probably not. But it's an interesting thought, and it's interesting, and I like the way that we're just kind of working our way through some of these thoughts, and trying to figure some of this out. But that's the promise that's given. So, we've seen this before. God does this great thing, gives a great covenant, and provides this great moment for Adam, right, and Eve in Genesis 2, and now Noah in Genesis 9. What happened in Genesis 3 after God did this great thing for Adam and Eve? Not a trick question. What happened? All right. They messed it up. They blew it at that point, right? So, if we're seeing this pattern, what might we anticipate we might find now with Noah? That he messes it up. And so we come to the end of chapter 9. And Noah, this is verse 20. Noah, as a man of the soil, began planting a vineyard. And he drank some of the wine and became drunk, and he uncovered himself inside his tent. Ham, the father of Canaan, saw his father naked, told his two brothers outside. Then Shem and Japheth took a cloak, placed it over both their shoulders, walking backward, they covered their father's nakedness. And their faces were turned away, and they did not see their father naked. So when Noah awoke from his drinking and learned what his youngest son had done to him, he said, Canaan is cursed. He will be the lowest of slaves to his brothers. He also said, Blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem. Let Canaan be Shem's slave. Let God extend Japheth, and Japheth dwell in the tents of Shem. And let Canaan be Shem's slave. All right. So, what? Now, first of all, this is the very first story that's told to us, right? Is this the first thing that happens after they get off the boat? No. How do we know that? Yeah, he plants a vineyard, and then he collects from it and turns it into liquor that's good enough for him to get verschnickered, right? So, obviously, a lot of time has passed. A lot of things have happened. This isn't the very first thing that takes place. This is the very first thing that takes place that the author says, I want you to see this. This is very purposefully placed here so that we're beginning to see this pattern. God institutes this covenant, this great thing. It's followed by man's failure. And here, God does this great thing, institutes this covenant in chapter 9, and it's followed now by Noah's failure. He gets drunk. He shames himself it says in his tent, but in his tent in some kind of an open enough way that what? His son sees him. I cannot give you all the particulars. How does this go about? Do they just wander into each other's tents or whatever happens? But it seems as if this is a public enough shaming, his nakedness, lying in his nakedness, that his son sees him, and his son then is very diplomatic and respectful about it, right? No, what does he do? Well, it's because he needed help, right? He's like, well, I can't take care of this by myself. I need to go get some help so that we can very respectfully take care of our father, right? Yeah, you can almost see him, guys, dude, seriously, you go take a look at Dad. Just look in the tent, man. The guy is wasted. Oh, he's just sitting there naked, all sprawled out. He is being as disrespectful as he possibly could be to his father. Do his brothers do the same thing? Do they treat him the same way? do they even look upon his nakedness to assess the situation? No, they grab a blanket, they walk backwards, put the blanket over top of him. And when he wakes up, he recognizes what's happened. And so he says in verse 25, or verse 24, when Noah woke up from his drinking, and he learned what the youngest had done to him. Verse 25, he said, Ham is cursed and will be the lowest of slaves to his brothers. Right? Is that what Charles read? Did I misread that one? What does he say? All right, cursed is Canaan. Canaan is cursed. And blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem, and let Canaan be Shem's slave. And let God extend Japheth, and Japheth live within the tents of Shem, and let Canaan be Shem's slave. Well, that seems odd, doesn't it? Who's Canaan? He's the son of Ham. That's not very fair, is it? I mean, don't we know, doesn't it tell us in Ezekiel that every person is punished for their own? The father doesn't receive the punishment for the son doesn't receive the punishment for the father. Each receives his own just punishment, right? What's going on here? That's not fair at all. Why does he curse Canaan instead of Ham? Any thoughts? Have you all noticed this before? So you've talked about it before. What's your conclusions here, Jan? Okay, going back to sorrow with the kids. I like the way you're thinking. I don't think that's necessarily in play right here. But it is an interesting idea, where what you find through Genesis, it's not only the mothers who suffer because of their children, right? The fathers suffer just as much. Abraham suffers just as much. Jacob suffers tons because of his children and their sinful ways, their sinful behaviors. So maybe something to that. Any other thoughts, though? Serena.
The reference in my Bible, whether it's accurate or not, says that it's Ham's punishment that he would have a son that would not bring honor to him. And that's, that the dishonor could be, the Canaanites become a, dishonorable nation because of Ham's sin.
Okay. I'm not sure that I would pull this as a curse about Ham being dishonorable. Canaan being a son that he would have.
I don't know that I agree with it either.
Yeah. But it is interesting. And I think it starts to carry, though the comment starts to carry us, I believe, down the correct path. Remember, to whom is Genesis originally written? What Israelites? Moses' generation. All right, the Moses generation of Israelites, right? Moses is the one credited with writing it. When does Moses write Genesis? 2,000 years later. Okay, a number of years after these events have taken place, right? But give me a time frame. What's going on as Moses is writing this? What's happening? What's the historical context of Moses and the Israelites? What land? Okay, they've just come out of Egypt, where God is leading them to what place? The land of Canaan. Is it the land of Ham? No, it's the land of Canaan. That's where they're headed. And right here in Genesis chapter 9, you see the beginning of a curse that says, hey, by the way, ultimately what's going to happen to the descendants of Ham, who are also the descendants of whom? If they're the descendants of Ham, they're the descendants of? Well, yes, but go the other way. Canaan, right? These are Canaan's descendants as well, who are living in the land of Canaan. And the curse is, they are going to serve the descendants of Shem. Now, who are the descendants of Shem? All right. Shem's genealogy is going to reach its ending point with Terah. You're going to start all over with Terah. Who is the father of whom? Abraham. And then the story continues in chapter 12 from there. Could it be that he focuses here on Canaan because Canaan is very important to the Exodus generation as they are leaving? They're on their way or in the wilderness or wherever they are when he writes this. The word Canaan is much more meaningful to them than the word Ham, or the name Canaan is much more meaningful than the name Ham. And he's saying, you have a right, a God-given right based on this curse in Genesis chapter 9. It was told before, you're on your way to Canaan to subdue them, to fulfill what was spoken years ago through Noah. Mike, Ryan's got a comment.
Chris, is just a side note, but it's interesting to me that Noah declares that the Canaanites are going to be slaves, but they end up with a land. And so that, to me, that kind of tells me they're at some point they're released from their slavery. Maybe not. That's kind of an assumption I'm making, but
well, the question, excuse me, the question would be, to whom are they going to be slaves?
To Japheth and they're slaves to. May Canaan be the slave of Shem, and may Canaan be the slave of Japheth.
Yeah, well, let Canaan be the Shem slave, and then let Japheth be almost like an equal, dwell in the tents of Shem. It's not a slave status, it's a brother status, with Shem, though, taking the lead. This, I don't think, plays out in their lifetime. What he's describing here is the Exodus. What he's describing are the Israelites, the descendants of Shem, who are finally going to the descendants of Canaan, and their whole purpose, their role, their identity is to enslave the descendants of Canaan at that point. And so this will be fulfilled when they arrive in the land of Canaan, and when the descendants of Shem subdue the descendants of Canaan the way that they are supposed to do. Which is why I believe he uses not the name Ham, which he could have, but very specifically the way that it's written, it focuses on Canaan, because that is the one that's pertinent to the generation who's actually reading these words for the first time. The original audience of this, the word Canaan would have jumped off the page at them. That would have meant something much greater than anything that we would think so. And they would have said, Canaan? Cursed be Canaan, let Canaan be the descendants of Shem? Well, I know all about that. That's where we're headed. That's where we're going. And we're the descendants of Shem. And the story would have made so much, come on up, Mike. The story would have made so much more sense to them in that way. John's got a comment.
Fast forward to God's promising to Moses, and then later to Joshua. He named 7 tribes continually that the Israelites would go through and conquer. The Jebusites, Hittites, Ammonites. Are those the same Canaanites that we were referring to tonight? They ended up being those tribes?
Yeah. Oh yeah, absolutely. And it's those within that land of Canaan and all those other ones that you mentioned as well become a part of that. Kathy, you have a comment?
I got a question, and it might take too long to answer tonight, but in verse 27, it uses the exact same words where up in verse 26, it says, may Canaan be the slave of Shem, and 27 says, may Canaan be the slave of Japheth. But what Japheth, most of his descendants did not settle in the land of Israel or Palestine, as far as I know. So my question is, how does that apply there? Or how do you think so?
I'm going to have to read it in the ESV. The CSB reads that differently. And this may go to what Ryan was saying earlier. Where are you seeing, let them be the slaves of Japheth? What translation are y'all using?
I'm using the New International.
New International, New King James. The ESV, CSB, they both read, may God enlarge Japheth.
That is right before that, and then right after that, well, let me read the whole verse. It says, may God extend Japheth's territory, may Japheth live in the tents of Shem, and may Canaan be the slave of Japheth.
Well, it just says, and let Canaan be his servant, and it's ambiguous, at least in the ESV, the CSB. I really think the focus is on the Shem Canaan relationship. That's the one that really matters to them, and that's the one that's going to be focused on in the genealogies moving forward. So that's the one that I would stress, because the other one, it's not there after this. But the relationship between Shem and Canaan is at this point. All right, we are out of time. So we're going to pick up and look at very quickly, the Tower of Babel story, get into chapter 12, and we'll look at those things next week. All right, thanks a lot for your questions, comments. Very good, very good. Participation. I didn't even have my phone open. Yep, I missed a couple, or at least something. Let's see here. Kevin, I've heard it said that a bow is always present somewhere in the world. That's interesting, that there may be that idea.